Welcome to this episode of Nicole B. in Focus, your dose of clarity in a world of chaos. Each episode zeroes in on one pressing issue, cuts through the noise, and gets straight to what matters. No guests, no fluff, just my take, the facts, and the context you need to think sharper and feel more informed. Today, we're talking about a controversial issue. We're talking about conservation, poaching, and John Hume. But I believe it is a conversation that we need to have urgently. Now, I don't see the world through a human first lens. I am at heart an ecocentrist, and I make no apologies for that, which means I believe in the value of the fact that the value of an animal life isn't measured by how it can serve us, its usefulness to us as humans. I don't believe that animals exist to entertain or serve humans. The slippery slope of eating meat aside, our wildlife exists because it belongs here, just as we do. And in most cases, like the rhino, it was here long before we were. Our wildlife is not a resource to be justified, but it is a reality that needs to be respected. To me, the fox in the hedgerow, the whale in the deep, the beetle under the bark, the baboon in the mountainside, each is a sovereign being, part of a vast, interconnected system that does not, I repeat, does not revolve around human convenience or profit. Preserving our wildlife does not have to be connected to us being able to necessarily profit from it. However, I am a realist. Now, when we look at the Chacma baboons in the Western Cape, it is our fault. It is our fault that they are in the position that they're in. Let there be no misunderstanding about that. They have become reluctant urban survivors, forced to adapt as human development steadily erodes their natural habitat. We have taken away their indigenous foraging areas. They've had to go to steep, inaccessible slopes. And so they have adapted. We have forced them to adapt. They've shifted to foraging and sleeping patterns in low-lying areas, and those low-lying areas are inevitably human-modified areas, where you have built your house over where they used to eat and sleep. Your house, vineyards, suburbs, they now rely heavily on exotic vegetation, pine nuts, grass, and all the rest of it. So when the Cape Conservation turns around and says that they are vermin and that they are a pest, you need to ask yourself why. Because we've made them that way. It's our fault. There is only so much ecological flexibility that any animal can have before eventually they need to do what they need to do in order to survive. And that inevitably means conflict with humans. They persist near the urban edge, even as neighboring groups have vanished. Their survival comes at a cost. Increased conflict with humans, shrinking safe zones, precarious dependence on land use practices, and never mind the fact that Cape Conservation is actively working against the preservation. I mean, you can't call yourself a conservation organization if you're actively working against conserving a species. It's the same as leopards in South Africa, facing a brutal and largely hidden crisis as they fall victim to illegal gin traps set by farmers attempting to protect their livestock. Now, look, I get it, okay? You invest in your livestock, you invest in your farm, that is your money, that is your livelihood. But quite frankly, I don't want to eat from a farmer that thinks it's okay to set gin traps for leopards, one of our iconic apex predators. I don't. These archaic devices and metal jaws designed to snap shut with crushing force are indiscriminate. They maim, they kill, they butcher, they destroy. And not just leopards. A whole lot of other animals get caught in these gin traps. They need to be abolished. They need to be banned. And farmers can work with organizations, work in harmony with nature, not in conflict with nature. A leopard is doing what it needs to instinctively. And the fact that a human being with a brain cannot understand that and cannot work around that and will trap an animal in a cage and allow it to starve to death and to die of dehydration and starvation is unacceptable. They play a vital role in regulating prey populations. And in fact, you consider jackals to be vermin and a problem, they can control it. But what we have a problem with, and where I think conservation has gone off the rails and taken a sharp left turn, is when it comes to rhino conservation. There are certain facts that we have to accept. Number one, you are losing the battle against rhino poaching. You are. I don't want one conservationist to stand up and say, oh, no, we're succeeding. No, you're not. You're not. Year on year, hundreds of rhinos are poached, butchered. So far, the first half of 2025, 195 rhinos have been lost. And when you consider that the gestation to replace one rhino is 14 to 16 months with only one calf, and they don't calve every single time, you are losing more than you are ever able to replace naturally. That's a fact. And until your backward, uneducated, and barbaric Chinese realize that grinding up rhino horn and drinking it or eating it is not going to give you a better hard-on, you are fighting a losing battle. Now, let me just put one thing into context. I am not John Hume's champion. What I wrote on X about the situation of him and Isaac du Toit and that being prosecuted was to provide context. Because I think when it comes to rhino conservation, context is imperative. Because that's what we've lost, is context. I cannot find a single program or campaign that has worked or stopped poaching. And what really gets to me more than anything else is hypocrisy. The hypocrisy of prosecuting John Hume, who didn't kill the rhinos, he just harvested the horns, versus not prosecuting somebody like David Mshlabu, who is, by the way, our Deputy Minister of Human Settlements or something like that, rewarded, who was implicated in an Al Jazeera documentary as being a conduit for poachers to get the rhino horn in diplomatic pouches out of the country and into Asia, Vietnam, China. He's never faced any prosecution whatsoever. We prosecute a handful of people who slaughter rhinos for their horns. And this is where the hypocrisy of rhino conservation and the prosecution of somebody like John Hume needs to be discussed. Now, whether or not he will be found guilty, I don't think so, but that's beside the point. The point is that for people to turn around and say that his theory that if you flood the market with legal rhino horn versus the what happens with illegal rhino horn, that if you do that, you will cut or even destroy the demand for illegal rhino horn. But see, there's no incentive in doing that. First of all, I don't know if it'll work or not. I don't know if anything like that has ever been tried. where you flood the market with what is termed an endangered a product from an endangered species to see if it actually destroys the illegal trade. But at this point in time, we need to acknowledge that we need to find another way to save this iconic species. Or is this a more of a case of not wanting to save this iconic species? And this is where we get to a very interesting point. Now, I found a post on Facebook, quite an interesting one, from a man called Ian Cox, who says that he actually had dealings with John Hume and he knows the man and he spoke quite highly of him, but it doesn't mean that I share those opinions of John Hume. But what I do is that, unfortunately, as much as I'm an ecocentrist, I have to also acknowledge reality. And the reality is that sadly, tragically, if we do not place some sort of value on an iconic species, they're not going to be saved. They're going to be poached into existence, into extinction. We have lost over 20% of our rhino population, I think since about 2010, if I'm not mistaken. 20%. We will lose more and more and more because naturally we can't replace it. South Africa holds over 87% of the African rhino population, black and white rhino. 87%. That is a huge responsibility. That on our watch, an animal that has been around for millions of years could actually go extinct, like the other African rhinos have. That will be our legacy. Now, Ian Cox stated a few things which I found quite interesting. And in terms of some of the context, he's right. He's absolutely right. Is that John Hume was brought down because his vision as a conservationist of creating value in rhino through breeding and sustainable use conflicted with the business model of nature conservation. Okay. Now, look, I am glad that nature conservation gets money. Okay, it is, because if there was no money poured into nature conservation, we'd have even less than what we have now. But there is still a conflict here. They're using the idea of rhino as a threatened species to raise money for what is in effect the religion of wilderness-based nature conservation. Now, sure, rhinos belong in the wild. They belong out there. And everybody can agree with that. I don't think anybody's going to fight that, regardless of what John Hume feels, or Ian Cox for that matter. However, we have game rangers and we have police who help poachers, who facilitate the slaughter of our rhinos and then the trafficking of those rhino horn out the country. We have ANC cadres who use diplomatic pouches to traffic the rhino out. And that is why they don't want any sort of legal form of the trade in rhino horn. Why? Because then the price will drop. At the moment, rhino horn per kilogram commands more on the black market than heroin and cocaine. Now, why would you give that up? If you're the ANC and you're making money from decimating our wildlife, you wouldn't want to give that up, because if you flood the market with legal rhino horn, the price is going to plummet. It's going to go down. And they have. They've bled him dry. Sure, he's not a saint, okay? He bred rhino for the purpose of being able to sell their horns. People, you breed cattle. You sell it for meat. But somehow, some people who make money from the exploitation of animals get away with it. Other people, they don't. It's that sort of hypocrisy that I don't like. And he's lost an enormous amount of money. He poured millions into it. The rhinos are still around. They've been sold to an NGO at a derisory low sum. I mean, not even a tenth of what they were valued at. So he's left with his rhino horn. Do we allow him to sell it on the market or not? And this is where we get to another interesting factor that Ian brought up. And they come up every single time, the Democratic Alliance, because who leads the Department in Environment now? A DA-led environmental authority is prosecuting John Hume and applying laws that are themselves illegal. The National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act is a fraud. It was enacted without a white paper or any consultation process that a white paper would require, no public participation. And I can't find, doesn't mean they're not there, but I simply can't find any submissions from conservation organizations about how our biodiversity should be managed. Laws have been promulgated. They've been challenged in court on multiple occasions, and those who have challenged it have won. Numerous courts have decided that much of the Biodiversity Act is unlawful. But of course, the Department of Environment will press ahead. Now, why do they want to press ahead? And we get back to the same old problem with the Democratic Alliance and the ANC. It is part of their drive to bring all resources under state control. Vast majority of our rhinos and our big five are in private hands. Not all, but a fairly substantial amount. And those are the only ones that are surviving, because they're being slaughtered in the Kruger National Park and in the other parks around the country. But the problem is it requires money. And that money comes from either ecotourism or trophy hunting. The latter are absolutely a bore. But who is going to save our rhinos? And when he turned around and said it is a big part of the command and control authoritarianism of nature. And that perfectly sums up the ANC and the DA. Their attitude towards the Chacma baboons, their attitude towards biodiversity. We will control it. We will profit from it. You will not. The state wants to own it all. And that is where we are at the moment when it comes to the discussion of conserving our rhino, one of our most iconic species, a species that people travel around the world to come and see. Now, the argument is that, yes, conservation must pay. And in order to make it pay, we keep them endangered. But the problem is you are losing control. There is going to come a day where our rhino, our black rhino, already critically endangered. What happens when there are two left and you've got round-the-clock security on them, and then they die of old age without even being able to reproduce? What happens then? Have you got an answer? Have you got a response? I want to know from all those conservation organizations, what are you going to do to save the rhino? Because at this point in time, Everything you've done so far has had scant results, scant at best. And instead of trying to silence someone who might have an idea, I'm not saying it will work. I'm not. But what you're doing so far and have done so far isn't working. And this is why this is a conversation that we need to have. Sometimes, even people who do things for the wrong reason have the right ideas. And it's a conversation we should have. Those are my thoughts for today. Please subscribe and follow me on YouTube and Spotify, on X and Facebook. Down in the comments section, I'll put the links. And please, I really want to hear from you. This is a conversation we need to have, and your input is vital and very important, and I'd like to hear. Thanks a lot. To my listeners, thank you for joining me. If you found this discussion thought-provoking, help us keep the conversation going. Hit that follow button on Spotify, and don't forget to connect with me on X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, stay curious.